In the winter of 1884, 18 men entered a valley that did not appear on any official map, and only the horses returned. The oldest records call the place Ashen Hollow, a deep depression between hills covered with dark pine trees, located north of an old stagecoach route in rural territory that was still poorly defined. It was a region known for persistent fog, poorly marked trails, and a stillness that travelers described as heavy. There was nothing supernatural in the reports, just isolation, extreme cold, and distance from any help. In the center of this valley, according to handwritten maps and private notes from surveyors of the time, there was a peculiar building made of light stone and rough wood, partially dug into the hillside. A closed room with no windows, used for years as a winter shelter for animals and people. In local archives, it appears with a simple, almost domestic name, the Snow Room. The building was maintained by two women known as the Hollow Sisters. Civil records are inaccurate, but indicate that their names were Margaret and Eliza Hollow, twins born around 1849, daughters of a woodcutter who never returned from a trip to the north. They had lived there since they were young, supporting themselves through small jobs, occasional lodging, animal care, and the sale of dry goods during the winter. The nearest community was almost 2 hours away on horseback. Even so, the sisters' names appear repeatedly in the diaries of merchants, hunters, and freight drivers, always in the same way, discreet, quiet, proper. Nothing in the report suggests violence, threats, or eccentricity. In early January 1884, after an unusual series of snowstorms, 18 horsemen left the main road and headed toward Ashen Hollow. They were experienced men, freight drivers, 2 former soldiers, a surveyor, and at least 3 longtime residents of the region. Their names appear in toll records, in books, and lists of supplies purchased days before the trip. They had a practical reason for the detour. The main road was blocked by ice and fallen trees. The valley offered shelter, water, and an alternative route known to few. The next morning, none of them were seen again. 3 days later, residents reported something that at the time seemed only strange, not alarming. Horses began to appear alone near the main road, one by one. Some still in full harness, others injured, exhausted, covered in dry ice in their manes. All belonged to the 18 men who had entered the valley. No bodies were found, no struggle recorded, no continuous tracks in the snow. The most disturbing detail, noted in a handwritten report by the local sheriff, is simple and cold. The horses' tracks indicated an organized return, as if they had been released together at the same point on the same night. It is in this silence of the archives, between the last entry into the valley and the first horse that returned alone, that the mystery begins to form. To understand what happened in Ashen Hollow, it is necessary to go back a few days and observe the valley before it became a whispered name in the records. The winter of that year was described as one of the harshest in a decade. Personal diaries of farmers in the region mention lower than usual temperatures, snow that accumulated for weeks, and nights that were too long even by local standards. Isolation was not the exception, it was the rule. Those who lived there learned to rely on silence, routine, and predictability. The Hollow sisters were part of this discreet balance. Margaret took care of the animals and practical exchanges, horseshoes, feed, storage. Eliza maintained the interior of the shelter, recorded debts, organized supplies, and according to an old account book found years later, recorded income and expenses with almost obsessive precision. There is no indication of illiteracy or mental disorder. On the contrary, the records reveal method, repetition, control. The so-called snow room was not a room in the usual sense. It was a partially underground compartment with thick walls of light-colored stone designed to maintain a stable temperature. It served to protect people and animals during heavy snowfalls. There was only one heavy reinforced wooden door, which was locked from the inside with a simple bolt. There were no windows. Ventilation came from a narrow duct carved into the rock, something common in shelters of the time. According to statements collected later, the place had already saved lives during other winters. No serious incidents had been associated with it until then. The 18 men arrived in the valley at dusk on January 6th. Indirect records, such as grocery purchase times and reports from a farmer who saw them passing in the distance, indicate that they were tired but calm. They were not running away. They were not arguing. They showed no more haste than was necessary to escape the approaching storm. Among them were Thomas Reed, 41, a freight driver known for traversing dangerous routes; Elias Morner, a former soldier described as quiet and disciplined; and Jonah Pike, a young surveyor on his first major winter crossing. There were also brothers, cousins, and neighbors, men who knew each other, trusted each other, and shared similar stories. Nothing in the records indicates tension among the group. When they arrived at Ashen Hollow, they were greeted by the sisters. A later testimony, given by a merchant who had passed through the area weeks earlier, describes Margaret opening the shelter door with a lantern in her hand, quickly assessing the men and horses before allowing them to enter. Eliza reportedly remained in the background, writing something in a notebook, without asking any questions. There is a recurring detail in the indirect accounts. The sisters did not offer extended hospitality. The shelter was for spending the night, nothing more. In the morning, the travelers were to move on. That night, the storm arrived with unusual force. Strong winds, heavy snow, almost zero visibility. The sound described in nearby diary entries is a continuous whistle, as if the entire valley were breathing with difficulty. Inside the shelter, according to the logic reconstructed by investigators years later, there was relative warmth, settled animals, tired men, and a silence imposed by exhaustion. No record mentions excessive drinking, arguments, or strange rituals. Everything points to an ordinary night, as ordinary as any other spent in extreme isolation. But there is one element that is repeated in the testimonies collected months later, always with hesitation. Some residents stated that on that night, no light was seen coming out of the shelter after the door was closed. No lamps, no reflections, nothing. Others said they heard, around dawn, the sound of horses being led, not in panic, but in single file, as if someone were guiding them carefully. These reports, taken alone, would not mean much. In rural areas, sounds blend together. Memories are shaped by fear. Still, when cross-referenced with written records, they create an unsettling gap. The last confirmed record of that night is a note in Eliza Hollow's notebook. Just 2 words, written in firm handwriting: door closed. There is no time. There is no continuation. What happened next, inside that snowy room, under a storm that erased all traces, was not recorded by anyone. And it is precisely this absence that begins to weigh on the case. The reconstruction of the disappearance begins where the records end, and where the silence becomes too thick to ignore. The dawn of January 7th, 1884, was described in weather notes recovered years later as one of the most closed in that winter. The snow fell without pause, pushed by irregular winds that erased any trace in a few minutes. The Ashen Hollow Valley, already deep by nature, became an enclosed space, with almost no reference to direction or distance. Inside the snow room, logic dictates that the men slept in shifts, as was customary. Some probably remained awake, attentive to the horses, the temperature, the sound of the wind pressing against the stone walls. The environment would have been stuffy, humid, lit only by 1 or 2 oil lamps, whose oil needed to be conserved. There are no records of screams, no reports of gunshots, no subsequent signs of physical struggle at the scene. What is known comes from fragments, small details that in isolation seem trivial, but together form a disturbing sequence. Around midnight, a farmer who lived almost 2 miles from the valley noted in his diary that he had heard the quiet movement of animals, as if horses were being led out of a shelter. He did not investigate. Storms were not times for curiosity. Hours later, as dawn approached, an unusual silence settled in. The wind died down. The snow continued, but without the constant whistling of the previous night. It was the kind of pause that the residents knew well. Short, deceptive. It was during this interval that, according to the subsequent analysis of the marks found, the horses were released. When the valley was reached by the first search team days later, the tracks had almost all been erased. Still, there was something impossible to ignore. Hoofprints concentrated in a single spot near the shelter's exit, pointing out of the valley. There were no signs of panic, no disorderly dispersion. The marks indicated that the animals had been lined up, led away, and released. Inside the shelter, the scene was even more disconcerting. There were no bodies. There was no blood. There were no clear signs of a struggle. The lamps were extinguished, but intact. Blankets were folded irregularly, as if they had been thrown down in a hurry. Some personal belongings, gloves, a canteen, a knife, remained on the floor. The door was unlocked. The detail most often cited in official reports is the condition of the interior. Too cold for a shelter that was supposed to maintain a stable temperature, as if the door had been left open long enough to allow freezing air to enter directly. No human footprints were identified leaving the site. No continuous trail was found leading into the valley, only confused fragments interrupted by accumulated snow. And then there is the final detail of that night, the last element considered concrete evidence. Among the objects found was Ashen Hollow's notebook. The pages following the note "door closed" were blank, except for a single mark near the end of the notebook. A crooked line of ink, as if the pen had been pressed hard and dragged without forming words. Experts at the time suggested something simple. The writing had been interrupted abruptly. It is not known whether this was due to fear, haste, or decision. What is known is that, from that point on, none of the 18 men, nor Margaret or Ashen Hollow, were ever seen again. The last confirmed evidence in the case does not come from inside the valley, but from the main road, at dawn on the third day. It was there that the first horse appeared, alone, covered in dry ice, walking in a straight line, as if still obeying an order that no longer existed. And it was not the only one. The initial reaction to the disappearance was slow, not out of neglect, but out of habit. In regions like that, delays were common. Storms isolated, diverted routes, and erased schedules. Only after the return of the third horse, followed by 2 others on the same day, did the silence begin to seem too wrong. The county sheriff, Samuel H. Borden, recorded in a report that the animals always returned from the same direction at irregular intervals, as if they had been released in small groups. Some had minor injuries to their legs, others were visibly exhausted, but none showed signs of desperate flight. It was this detail that bothered the men accustomed to reading tracks. Panicked horses do not return in a straight line. The search officially began on the 5th day after the disappearance. A group of local residents, 2 sheriff's deputies, and a hired tracker made their way to Ashen Hollow. The path was partially overgrown but still recognizable. When they reached the valley, it seemed untouched. Too quiet, according to one of the participants. The shelter was there. The door was unlocked. There were no signs of recent occupation beyond what had already been described. There were no recent food scraps, no warm ashes. The snow room looked like it had been abandoned weeks ago, not days. The search lasted for almost a month, interrupted repeatedly by new snowfalls. Few traces were found. A partially buried glove about 300 meters from the shelter, a hat caught on low branches, and indistinct marks that could not be reliably attributed to human footsteps. Nothing to indicate the collective movement of 18 men. Over time, rumors began to surface. Some said the men had taken a wrong shortcut and succumbed to the cold on higher ground. Others hinted at internal conflict, perhaps a silent quarrel that ended in dispersion. There were also those who suggested that the Hollow sisters were somehow involved, not through cruelty, but through omission. Perhaps they had closed the door too early. Perhaps they had not opened it when someone knocked. None of these hypotheses found concrete support. The turning point came months later, when an old acquaintance of the Hollow family gave the sheriff some previously unknown information. He claimed that the snow room had been renovated years earlier by the sisters' father after a partial collapse. According to him, during this renovation, a second internal compartment was created, separated by a wooden and stone partition, used to store compacted ice and perishable supplies. This detail never appeared in the shelter's official records. When a new inspection was carried out in the spring, investigators found traces of this structure, fitting marks on the wall, remains of rotten wood, and an irregular space behind one of the side walls. The compartment, however, had collapsed, probably under the weight of snow accumulated over the winter. No bodies were found there, no direct evidence, but the scenario reconstructed by investigators became a different one. The most accepted and most silent hypothesis suggests that during the early hours of the morning, something led to the shelter door being left open for a prolonged period. Perhaps an attempt to move the horses, perhaps a decision made under pressure. The extreme cold would have quickly invaded the enclosed space. In such conditions, confusion sets in without fanfare. Hands lose strength, voices fail, decisions fragment. If the men tried to leave in small groups, seeking alternative shelter, or trying to lead the animals out, the valley would have done the rest. The snow erased paths. The cold imposed limits. Time dissolved evidence. The Hollow sisters in this scenario would not have been active agents, but part of the same human error, placing too much trust in a shelter that failed when it needed to function most. No formal charges were filed. The case was officially closed 2 years later, classified as a collective disappearance due to exposure and structural collapse in an isolated environment. Still, the final report ends with a sentence that offers no comfort. There is no evidence of deliberate violence, only decisions made in silence, and too late. But even this explanation leaves something open, because it does not explain why no one returned, nor why the horses were carefully released. Decades later, when Ashen Hollow no longer appeared even on regional maps, the case was mentioned again only in footnotes, local historical compilations, and archives of unsolved disappearances from the late 19th century. The valley was swallowed by time in the same way it swallowed the men that night. Without noise, without clear marks, without the need for immediate explanation. The snow room no longer exists. Photographs taken in the early 20th century show only scattered stones, wood darkened by time, and an uneven slope, as if the land itself had decided to erase what had been there. No plaque was erected. No memorial was built. The place simply ceased to be visited. The names of the 18 men remain recorded in toll books, cargo lists, and trade notebooks. Some appear as husbands, others as only children, others only as initials on yellowed documents. In certain tax records, their names continue to appear for years, later crossed out in pencil when their absence became too definitive to be ignored. Even fewer traces remain of the Hollow sisters. There are no death certificates. There is no record of their departure from the region. Only sparse notes, always indirect, always in the past. 2 women who existed almost exclusively in the accounts of those who passed through there and who disappeared in the same way they lived, without attracting attention. The researcher who last reconstructed the case in 1931 wrote something that today seems less like a conclusion and more like a warning. He noted that in extreme environments, danger rarely presents itself as sudden violence or obvious chaos. It almost always arises as overconfidence in routines that have worked before. Shelters fail. Doors are left open for seconds longer than they should be. Small decisions accumulate in the dark, without witnesses, without formal records. And when the cold sets in, it does not distinguish between guilt, intention, or experience. The horses that returned alone were not interpreted at the time as a gesture of mystery, but as a simple reflection of training. Animals obey familiar paths when there is no one else to guide them. They return because they know how to return. Men do not. Today, Ashen Hollow is just one forgotten name among many others, but the case remains one of the few in which there is no single mistake to point to, nor a clear person to blame. Just a sequence of ordinary human choices made under pressure, in silence, at the wrong time. And perhaps that is why the disappearance still bothers us, because there are no monsters in the records. There are no signs of deliberate cruelty, just the cold, the weather, and a valley that never gave back those who entered it. And in the final files, next to the last list of names, someone wrote in the margin, in firm handwriting, Not every disappearance leaves traces. Some leave only space.